Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be with you here tonight. It's the first time that I'm in your wonderful country. I'm looking forward to stay on a few more days. I will teach at a seminar east of Bratislava with a student group who are interested in Austrian economics. Many thanks to Mr. Gonda for his warm welcome. I appreciate this very much, and I'm very happy to contribute to the lecture series organized by the Conservative Institute, which I've known for a few years, because other colleagues have been lecturing in the series, so I'm happy to give a contribution tonight. Now, just to give me a rough impression, who among you is an English speaker? Would you please raise your hands? Okay, so it's about half, which means I will try to speak slowly so that the translators can catch up. My subject is financial markets and the wealth of nations. So the expression wealth of nations is an allusion to the most famous book that has been published in economics, namely Adam Smith's book on with the title Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. And in that book, Smith made what at the time was a very controversial claim, namely that the production of goods and services does not depend on how much money people spend on consumer goods. That was the origin of an intellectual movement called the classical school. And the classical school was very much at odds with the prevailing wisdom at the time when Adam Smith first published his book. The prevailing wisdom at the time was that the motor, the engine of economic activity and of economic growth is the spending of money. The more you spend, the higher the revenues of the firms are, so therefore the firms can spend more money, and so on and so on. Now, so Adam Smith opposed this notion, and he explained, well, actually the spending does not matter much. What really matters is the relationship between the different amounts that we spend on different goods, and the relationship between the amount that we consume and the amount that we save. The bigger the amount that we save, well, the better it is for the economy. Now that is very controversial today, as you might guess from my little description. I like to start off with this little reminder, because today, of course, we've fallen back into the bad old times that Adam Smith was combating at the end of the 18th century. We are back at a time where Nobel Prize winners announced that actually saving might be counterproductive. It might be a petty individual luxury that permits some people to enrich themselves at the expense of the larger commonwealth. And that the way to go forward is to spend as much money as possible. And if the private citizens are not willing to spend all their money, well, then the government should step in heroically, get it into a lot of debt, and spend this money. Now, what I do tonight in my lecture is to apply the same thoughts by taking account of financial markets, which play a huge role today, which they did not play in Adam Smith's time. Adam Smith's work has been carried on by the Austrian school at the end of the 19th century and then throughout the 20th century. But during the first 100 years or so of the Austrian school, and probably more than the first 100 years, financial markets did not play a significant role within the economy. Today we are confronted with the spectacular presence of financial markets. There are, of course, if we are just thinking of the volumes to give you a feel for this, the total volume of all financial assets in the world is somewhat around $300 trillion. Okay, $1 trillion is a figure with 12 zeros. Okay. Now this compares with world GDP, which is around 60 or 70 trillion dollars. So this is just around the financial assets, which are shares and companies, and bonds, industrial bonds and government bonds. We're not yet talking about exotic things like derivative products, options, futures, swaps, and and so on. Don't expect me to explain this right now. I mean, if you're interested in this, I might come back on this. Right? So the total volume of all these things combined is something north of 600 trillion, more something like $700 trillion as compared to world GDP around 60 or 70. Okay. Now, I didn't look up what the GDP of Slovakia is, but I guess it will be something like, well, it will be less than a trillion euros. Okay. So we have here a mammoth, we have a big room, and during the last financial crisis, it has become obvious that financial mechanisms play a central role in the operation of our current market economies. So this is for me then the reason to I'll deal with this subject and analyze the causal mechanisms that are here at work in much of my recent research, and I will try to give today something like an executive summary for you. Okay. Now, the objective of my talk will be to highlight the beneficial role that financial markets may play within a market economy, and that they would play if governments did not intervene even further. And then to focus on one special type of government interventions, namely monetary interventions, which play a very important role today, and show how these monetary interventions pervert the role that financial markets play within the economy. Rather than being an element of economic order that reinforces the other elements, in particular industrial production, they become an element of disorder that destroy value and create unjust relationships between the members of society. I will proceed in 3 steps. There's something wrong with my PowerPoint here. When I saved it, it was still okay. Right? So I'll explain this to you. So you see, we will start off the analysis of the market economy in 3 steps. We will compare these different elements. We'll start off with the first step, which is here, right? Which is see analysis of the market economy by first supposing that there are no financial markets and there are no monetary interventions. So therefore, we get a feeling for how a market economy would operate. What will be the results of this operation? What are the shortcomings and so on? Then in the second step, we'll consider how the presence of financial markets changes this initial scenario, but we'll just introduce financial markets and not yet any monetary interventions, right? So this is the second step. It's not 4 and 5, it's actually 2. Okay, so this is 1, it's not 1 and 2, it's 1, and this should be 2. And then the third step, we'll introduce monetary interventions and see how they modify this in turn. The reason why I proceed this way is just for, not only for pedagogical purposes, is actually the only way you can meaningfully analyze the relationships that are here involved. Unfortunately, we do not have material and we do not have the methodology that would allow us to do the same thing with imperial material. So, let's start off by analyzing the economy without financial markets and without monetary interventions. The very first thing that we need to point out is the following. In such an economy, there would prevail a price deflationary monetary environment. Prices would tend to fall in such an economy. All prices would tend to fall. The reason is that when the economy grows, now I say this very non-technically, right? When the economy grows, then all other goods but money become less scarce as compared to money. Suppose that the money supply does not change at all. In the extreme scenario, there's no change in the money supply. We always use the same quantity of money. And now we are starting to produce more of the other goods. Then these other goods become more plentiful relative to money. Money becomes more scarce as compared to these other goods. And as a consequence, because money becomes more scarce, becomes more valuable, it is natural that therefore you exchange lower quantities of money in exchange for a given quantity of some non-monetary good. Okay. Now this is indeed not just a little idea, not just a little theoretical idea, it is what we actually did observe, right? We never had a scenario in history in which the money supply remained constant. Such a situation has never existed. But we had situations with relatively few monetary interventions, with a relatively light-handed monetary intervention, most notably during the 19th century. So during the 19th century, the money supply in most Western countries grew at a very moderate rate, very slow rate. And as a consequence, economic growth proceeded at a faster pace than the production of new money. So money grew more scarce as compared to all the other goods. Therefore, there was a tendency for prices to fall. This is what we see here for the case of the United States. We have here United States consumer price data from 1800 to 1970. The main reason why I like to point out data from the United States is not that I think that this would be particularly relevant for us here in Europe, or for you in particular in Slovakia, but because they have a statistical office that publishes figures as from 1800. So that is very interesting. Now I'll show you in a minute, I'll show you other figures for the UK. So in the case of the United States, you see here that the broad tendency until World War II was for there to be a secular tendency for prices to fall, which was interrupted by wars. Right? You see the prices here they fall, here they fall, here they fall, and here they fall. And they are just little spikes, namely here, here, and here. Oh, excuse me, I was going to go back. Three spikes. And these three spikes, ladies and gentlemen, result from a very strong production of money that occurred during the Civil War, during World War I, and during the War of 1812 and 1814, a little known war here in Europe, but there was a war in the United States then, during which the Americans financed their military operations with the creation of money. So they just printed the dollars that they needed to pay their soldiers and to pay the industrialists that delivered arms and so on. So as a consequence, during these war experiences, the money supply grew very, very strongly and very fast. And money therefore became less rare relative to the other goods. Therefore, money prices, unit prices rose. Right? But you see, as soon as the war activities were gone, the government returned to normal, that is, they no longer intervened, they no longer pushed for the further creation of money, and as a consequence, money grew scarcer and scarcer as compared to the other goods, because they had growth, and as a consequence, you had the price deflationary tendency. Until World War II, right? You see here, this is here starts the spike for World War II, and so in a way, it's a normal experience, because I don't say it's a good thing to finance a war with the production of money, but that's a separate issue. We just want to understand what's going on. So that's what they did. And now for the first time after World War II, they did not revert back to normal. And not only did they not do this in the US, but the monetary authorities did not do this either in Europe. And in fact, all over the civilized world. For the very first time, we have had, in the past 2 generations or more, an experience of constantly rising prices in peace times. This is a completely new experience on a world historical level. It's never been something like this. We are living in an age of inflation. And I need to stress this because all of us here in this room, except for a very few, as I see, have been born after this started. So all we've ever known, all we've ever experienced is an environment in which prices rise constantly. We somehow think, therefore, we're inclined to think that this is just how things ought to be, just how a market economy operates. And then we might start to believe silly things like, well, you actually need to have ever higher prices if you produce more goods, or if you produce goods of a better quality, right? Because they need to be exchanged for higher payments and stuff like this. But this is not actually how market economy operates. Entrepreneurs can create ever more goods even when prices fall, because the profits of a firm do not depend on the level of the prices, they depend on the spread, on the difference between the money that they receive and the money that they spend. So if they produce more products and sell them for a turnover that shrinks, this is not a problem, as long as they are also able to diminish their costs. And this is exactly, ladies and gentlemen, what happens under a natural monetary system in which there are no monetary interventions. And in such a system, all prices sink. And therefore, for companies, well, the prices of the products that they create, they sink, but the prices of the factors of production that they need sink as well. So they may remain profitable, they may invest even more, right, even though there is a shrinking price level. That's how it works. For households, it's similar, right? The absolute level of our monetary revenue is of little importance for our welfare. Rather, what is important for us is the relationship between our revenue and the prices of the goods that we need to buy. So if my revenue diminishes by 20% or even more, right, that's not a problem as long as the other prices of the things that I buy also diminish. That's not always the case, but sometimes it is the case. Right? And in the historical experience that we're talking about, it was the case, on average. Right? Not for every single individual, of course. Some were losing in this process, but for the great majority. Just as today, right, it's not the case that in an environment of rising prices, everybody is a winner. It's true that everybody's revenue eventually rises. Right? Young people who enter the workforce today, they start off with a certain level of revenue, and when they will have my age or even older, well, they will be 70 or something like this, well, they will have a higher revenue. Because in a price inflationary environment where all prices rise, well, eventually your revenue rises as well. Even if you stay as stupid as you have been at the age of 18. But of course, that's very rare, right? So most people become even more intelligent and better trained and so on. So they, right, the revenue rises for different reasons. So even if your revenue rises, it does not necessarily mean that you're a winner, because if the things that you buy rise in price faster or earlier than your revenue rises, well, then you lose. Okay. So this historical experience is a fact. And it's a fact that economies in Western Europe and also in the US grew very fast under a price deflationary environment. We've just to recognize it's not just a theory, it's a fact, it's a historical fact. If we look at other countries, we have essentially the same experience. So I show you here the price figures for the UK. We have an even longer time series. It's from 1800 to 2013. And you see there was a great stability of prices here. There's a little spike actually, it was just a little bit, because there was something called the Napoleonic Wars, right? So that enticed the Her Majesty government to increase the money supply to pay soldiers and so on. And then there was, as in the US, this very long secular tendency for prices to diminish across time, or at least to remain stable. Then we have the spike for World War I. You see this here. Right? This is World War I. And then we have, again, a deflationary tendency. And then we have World War II. And up you go. It never stops. Okay. This is the age of inflation. This is where we are, right? The age of inflation. So our point then in the Wage Guide is to talk about the economic and social consequences of the age of inflation. What does this actually mean? It's another way of putting this. Well, one thing that it means is, you see here, the difference between the two charts is, you see, this is just for the students, right? This is a logarithmic scale, right? And the other one is a linear scale. Right? So if you don't understand it, it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter. But you see, so the logarithmic scale, we're using this in order to illustrate changes, right? Growth process and so on.
if I use a linear scale, right, so this blob here for World War I, you see it completely disappeared, right? It's just a little piece of sand. And then the price is just like a hockey stick, right? Prices go up after the suspension of payments in 1971, right? So this when the world economy went off the gold standard, right? And you see then from then on prices have been increasing much faster than before. Okay, so my whole presentation is gone. Okay, so all these points should show up one by another, but so they all show up at the same time. Doesn't matter. So let's look into this. So what does growth? We say growth implies price deflationary tendencies. So this not only concerns consumer goods, we just looked at the consumer price index, it also concerns durable consumer goods. Durable consumer goods is not only household apparel like washing machines and so on, but it's also vehicles, and most importantly, it's real estate. A piece of land, a house, an apartment, a garage, whatever you might buy, is a durable consumer goods. Now, it can also be a capital good if it's used to earn revenue. That's a different thing. Right? But in most cases, if you look at national statistics, I think it will not be different for Slovakia. Right? Most buildings that exist are actually not owned by firms, they're owned by households, so they serve consumer purposes. And all these buildings are durable consumer goods, and their prices tend to decline in a natural economy. The reason is very simple, is because there is the price deflationary tendency, which can only be overcompensated if from time to time you repair and improve the house. If you improve the house, well, then you might obtain a higher price on the market, but then in a way it's also a different good. The same tendency for prices to decrease exists for fixed capital goods, so machines, installations, buildings used by firms, lorries, and so on, and their prices tend to shrink as well. Now, most amazingly, the same tendency exists even for capital. Okay, so what's the difference between capital goods and capital? I must put on my professor's hat. Capital is that part of our wealth that we use to earn future revenue. So I own a whole lot of things, that is, I actually don't own much because I'm just a professor. But you might own a lot, so you have a house and buildings and all these, and cars and so on. Now, most of the stuff you only use for your personal use. It's a consumer good. It's part of your wealth, but it's not capital. But if you use a good in order to earn future revenue with it, it becomes automatically a capital good. So the same physical object can be classified, and is classified differently by economists, depending on its use. The same chair that we see here, this chair is a capital good, because it serves the hotel to earn future revenue. The same chair, if it would stand in your house or in my house, well, it would be a consumer's goods, unless our house would serve similar purposes as the hotel. So capital, right, is the monetary equivalent of all those things, of all those parts of our wealth that we use to earn future revenue. Now, this monetary value tends to shrink. Okay? It tends to shrink for all individual capitals, right? It does not tend to shrink for the capital as a whole. Capital as a whole depends on how much savings are being invested in firms and so on. But the monetary value of the capital owned by a company, by an entrepreneur, is always a reflection of the monetary value of the discounted future values of the present value of all the goods that he will be able to produce with all his capital. Now, in a price deflationary environment, the prices of the goods that my capital will produce shrink, so the future prices shrink, and this tends to be reflected in the present by a lower tendency for an ever lower capital value in such a firm. Now, that's the general tendency, okay? And that raises some interesting questions. One interesting question is, well, if this is so, why should anybody be stupid and to save and invest at all? If the value of the things that we own shrinks. Now there are several answers that we need to give to this in order to explain why actually in such a price deflationary environment things happen as they did happen. Because we know already what happened, we just need to explain why. So on the one hand, people save, even if they lose in monetary value, they save to prepare for future consumption. Right? Even, let's say, if I know, so I just invest in a firm and the capital value might diminish, well, it might actually still be useful for me, well, it might be a way for me to prepare my future consumption, even if nobody else is concerned. Now, savings in such an environment very often consists simply in cash hoarding. And cash hoarding is, of course, a very interesting thing to do if you have a price deflationary environment. And it is actually what most people did at the time. Most people, especially people with low incomes and people who did not have much wealth, were hoarding cash. Or just at the time we had a monetary system based on gold coins and on silver coins, so they were just saving little silver coins, or if the revenue was a little higher, sometimes a gold coin from time to time, and just stockpiling them, maybe hiding them in the garden, or so, I don't know, some safe deposit box, or maybe paying this on a deposit account at the bank. Different ways to do this. And it's still actually what households do, low-income households would do today if they were not discouraged from doing this, as we will discuss later. Okay, so households may save even in such an environment, but there would be even capital investments. Capital investments would take place for two reasons. The one is that even though the monetary value of your capital might diminish, the amount that you gain, so the monetary revenue that you generate, might overcompensate this loss. So let's say you invest $100 million at the beginning of the period, and then the economy grows, so the prices tend to shrink, and at the end of the time, the capital value of all of the things that you own, that you use to earn future revenue, shrinks to 98. But if you have earned, let's say, a return on your investment of 4, well, then you're actually richer at the end of the period than you would have been without. So even though you had a loss in capital value, well, you had an overall gain in wealth that you would not have had unless you had invested. And that's why people invest even then. The second reason, and that's even more fundamental, the second reason is that even if you might not earn a monetary return at all, you might still gain in real terms. The monetary value of your capital might shrink, let's say from 90 to, from 100 to 98. But the things for which you could exchange it, right, the amount of consumer goods for which you could exchange it on the market might actually increase. Because in a price deflationary environment, well, the purchasing power of money increases. So let's say you have a reduction of your capital value by 2%, as I've said, right? It shrinks from 100 to 98. And at the same time, the overall price level shrinks by 5%. So then these 98 have 5% more purchasing power than they had the year before, which means that the real purchasing power of the 98 is higher than the purchasing power of the 100 the year before. And this purchasing power you would not have had if you had not invested. So even in such a circumstance then, capital investments are likely to take place. Okay. Swipe your finger slower. Actually, I didn't swipe my finger at all. Now we have a little hiccup here. Yeah, okay. Okay, wow. So part of my, no, so I need to go back to the other, I need to go back to this. Wait a minute. I need to go back to this because otherwise I risk losing points. Okay. Okay. Yeah, so we're here. Okay, so we talked about these things. Okay. Let's move on to the next thing. What are the implications of this for the real economy? Clearly, if prices for consumer goods tend to diminish in the course of time, right? We have a price deflationary tendency, then you have an incentive to hold back current purchases of consumer goods. You just have to wait for a year or so, and then you could have the same thing at a lower price. Right? So you have an incentive to hold back. Now, this is the moment, right? So all economists agree on this. Then some of the economists grow very nervous. They say, you see, there's something very fishy in such a situation, because we get then into a death spiral. Right? I hold back spending now, right? So if I hold back my spending now, then the prices would fall even more. If the prices fall even more, then the incentive to hold back my spending now becomes even greater. So I do this again, and again, and again, and again, and finally nobody's spending any money anymore, and the economy sinks into the equivalent of an economic black hole. It just vanishes. Okay. This, of course, as you might have guessed from my facial expression, is nonsense. Right? So why it is nonsense? The reason is that even though such incentives exist to hold back current spending on consumer goods, there are two very powerful obstacles that make that the spending is never likely to go to zero. The first one is the simple need to survive, okay? Sometimes called the constraint of the stomach. In order to live the happy day when our TV screens and our cars and our carpets will be less expensive than they are today, well, I first need to survive the period until this day. Which means in a society in which I don't grow my own potatoes and my own apples, and I don't burn my own brandy, that I, well, need to buy these things to make it through the time. And so I always spend some money just to make it through the future. The second reason is that actually many things we like to have earlier rather than later. Right? It's very good to know that in 10 years, vacationing in Spain might be much more affordable than it is today. So does this mean that I should not go on a vacation for 10 years? This seems crazy, right? Or they say, I mean, think of jewelry, right? There are many ladies here in this room, or fashion, right? So certain things. So you hold back 5 years because in 5 years it will be less expensive as today. Right? So it is ridiculous, right? So there is this phenomenon called time preference that push people, also they have a demand to spend money on things even though they know that they will be more affordable in the future because they like to have them earlier rather than later. So that's not a problem. Consumer spending will diminish, and even the spending on durable consumer goods, most notably real estate, right, will tend to be postponed in such a situation. And the only exception here are fixed capital goods, which are also durable goods, but they're not consumer goods. Right? Fixed capital goods would be bought because they allow us to generate revenue, which is not the case with consumer goods. And finally, in such a situation, as we have already said, hoarding would be encouraged. Many people would just hoard their savings. So this raises then the fundamental question, whether this would be bad for the real economy. And again, as you might guess from the way that I raised the question, so I would not answer, well, it's actually bad for the economy. No, it's not bad for the economy. The economy can very well function in such an environment. Consumer spending is not, as Adam Smith has said, and he was perfectly on the point in this regard, is not the engine of economic growth. What is the engine of economic growth are savings. Now, you might ask yourself the question, how is it possible to save and to invest more money if the revenue that I can realize with this is shrinking? And, well, you've got to take my word for this. I spent a few hours with my students precisely on this point, right, to make this crystal clear. But I'll just give you maybe one numerical example, right, to illustrate this. Let's say you have a company that produces these water bottles, and the company realizes turnover, so all the money that it receives, let's say, is 133 million euros. Okay? The company itself spends 121. Okay. So it creates revenue for other companies that sell to it the water and other appliances that it needs and so on. And this company in its turn will also spend money on its own factors of production. Now the point is, if the revenue of the first company diminishes, and because the citizens spend less money on consumer goods and save more, then it is still possible to invest these savings, this additional money, in sectors of the economy that are removed from final consumption. So that it's true that in such a scenario, the consumer goods sector would shrink, right, as far as turnover, as far as monetary figures are concerned. But other sectors of the economy would be built up. And most notably, we would build up sectors of the economy that produce machines that help us to produce water. Maybe this, initially this was produced manually, right? So people actually producing the glass in which the water was bottled in a workshop. And eventually, so that now there are more savings available, so it's possible to build up firms that specialize in building machines necessary for the creation of these bottles. Right? So you substitute human labor, or you replace the human labor in the consumer goods industry with human labor somewhere else in the economy, and you invest less money in the final sector, in the consumer goods sectors, and more money in other sectors of the economy that are removed from final consumption. I know this is not a complete explanation, but the students here who want to look into this can find out easily by reading Murray Rothbard's book, for example. It's a very good textbook with the title Man, Economy and State. You have an explanation of this. Or you can also read another classic text from Friedrich Hayek, Prices and Production, which explains the same thing. Right? So the point is, in all cases, that what we do if we save more, right? If we hold back consumer spending, well, we save more, and these additional savings, well, they're either hoarded or they can be invested in other sectors of the economy that are removed from final consumption. And if we do this, if we invest them in sectors that are removed from final consumption, then the following happens. The economy becomes more developed, right? That is, people who are creating the final consumer goods are working with much more tools than before, because they have all the machines now at their disposition. Right? And therefore, even though they are less numerous, they can create now more goods than before. I started off with this bottle example. Let me take another example that is familiar to everybody here. Let me take the case of agriculture. Imagine how agriculture functioned at the beginning of the 19th century. Essentially, well, first of all, virtually the entire population was working in the fields somewhere. Right? So something like 70 or 80% of the entire population, I guess, of Slovakia and many other areas of Europe was exactly the same thing. So people were working there in the fields, and they were working essentially with their hands or with very primitive tools. Right? In this way, they were producing food that was, in normal years, enough to sustain all of them during the rest of the year. Now think of how things are going today. Today, we have in virtually all European countries, less than 5%. In France, actually, it's less than 1% of the population working in the fields. And this much smaller number produces the same amount of food, and often more than our ancestors produced 200 years ago with their hands. And the reason why they are able to do this is because they have all these machines, and they have all the technology at their disposition. And how does it come that we have the machines and the technology? Well, it's because we have started building up firms in sectors removed from the final production of consumer goods. Firms that produce or that prepare the eventual production of consumer goods by creating the tools and the knowledge and so on. So this is exactly, again, it's not just a theory, it's exactly what has happened in the course of time. So, the fact that consumer spending diminishes is not an obstacle for economic growth. What happens in a price deflationary environment is people are spending less money, but because prices diminish even more than the amount that they spend, well, they actually obtain more in exchange for it. If I spend 3% less this year on consumer goods, but the value of money increases by 10%, well, then I get 7% more goods in exchange for it. So even though I spend less money, I get more goods. And this is, again, exactly what we saw in the 19th century, what we saw reflected in the figures. So the level of consumer spending is completely secondary. Consumer spending needs to be seen in two relations. One is the relationship between different types of consumer spending, because this directs the economy. Right? If consumers say, well, we are spending less than last year, but we're spending our money differently. We're spending more money on chairs and less money on microphones. Well, then in a market economy, more chairs would be produced, because the production of chairs becomes more profitable, and the production of microphones would be reduced because microphone production becomes less profitable. So that's how it operates. And the second relation is the relationship between consumer spending and savings. So the greater is the amount of savings relative to consumer spending, the more we can build up sectors that prepare the final work, the final production of consumer goods. Okay, but then we talked about money hoarding. We said that money hoarding would also be encouraged, right? I mean, maybe I got you around to understand, yes, if we save more and we invest this, yeah, so this might be good for the economy. But how about money hoarding? Isn't this a difficult way? Isn't this a way just to suffocate the economy, to strangle it? Okay. And this is indeed what we might think if we look on money hoarding in analogy to the hoarding of other goods. Let's say if we are hoarding wheat in our reservoirs, right, then this wheat is not available to anybody but us. Right? So nobody can use this, and people might starve, but we have our silos full of grain. Now, in that case, indeed, hoarding might be problematic. It's not problematic, it's never problematic in the case of money. What money hoarding does is to create further pressure on prices. If you hoard money, you stock it in your pockets, on your bank account, in a hole that you've dug into your garden, right? Into whatever, you just withdraw it from circulation. That means that money becomes scarcer. Right? The money that is still in circulation becomes scarcer as compared to all the other goods. So again, right, the value of money in circulation increases relative to the other goods. Now what does this mean? It means that those people who still do spend their money, who do not hoard it, suddenly have money that has a higher purchasing power. So if this side of the room starts hoarding money and the other side of the room goes on spending money, then their hoarding will entail a situation in which the prices diminish, so that you guys can, with the same amount of money as before, you can buy more things. It's almost as though this part of the room had given you a credit. Almost. Materially, it boils down to the same thing. If you are given a credit to those guys, well, they could have bought more. But here the point is, they withhold spending. They don't spend at all, so money becomes more scarce, and the prices will diminish even further, so you can buy more. So we see this money hoarding has very similar effects as a credit, right? Credit can be handed out to producers. It can also be handed out to consumers. Right? So some of you might spend the money in the context of your firm. Right? Others might spend it on current consumption and so on. So but in any case, hoarding does not withdraw any source. The hoarding of money does not withdraw any resources from the economy. It allows the economy just to work as normally as when there is no hoarding. Money hoarding actually finances other people. Okay, so I spent a lot of time on the first thing. We did not yet talk about financial markets. You might ask yourself the question, well, after an hour, we're still not there in financial markets. Right? But I needed to make this preparation because otherwise you will not get it. Right? So we needed to really stress these things. So, we can turn to financial markets. We start off with the definition. What is a financial market? What is a financial exchange? In a financial exchange, we are exchanging valuable promises. Right? That's the general definition. And to make it very simple, let's say we're exchanging promises of future payments. The simplest case that we can consider is the case of a credit. You lend me 1,000 euros, and I promise to return the 1,000 euros to you in a year from hence, plus some remuneration for your kindness, right, and for your renunciation to current consumption. That's a financial market. It's an exchange of promises. Right? Promises, empty promises, and lies. Okay? Promises are cheap. We can promise a lot of things. So it's actually not cheap, it's actually difficult to produce promises that have any value. These promises are called, the financial markets, they're often called securities, because the promises are being safeguarded with various guarantees that come with it. For example, somebody who takes out a credit typically would pledge some part of his wealth. So I take a credit from a bank in order to buy a house for my family, then typically, as long as I have not paid back that credit, the house would be, the guarantee would be pledged as a collateral, as is the technical expression, for the bank. So if I'm not able to pay back, well, the bank would own the house. So my promise is then not quite an empty promise, it comes with guarantees. Therefore, this promise is valuable. Therefore, the bank hands me over money. Some people have a good reputation, so their promise has value. Other people are known as liars, damn liars, and their promises have no value. Sometimes we vote for them nevertheless, but it's a different question, different problem. So I don't go into the details, right? There are different types of promises, right? So there are shares, right? There are debt instruments, bonds, and so on. There are these exotic stuffs like options and so on. They have all this thing in common that they are promises of future payment. What is now the impact of such promises on the price level? Well, from an economic point of view, these are additional non-monetary goods that enter the market. As a consequence, they make money even more scarce than it would otherwise have been. So the presence of financial markets in a natural economy reinforces the price deflationary tendencies that would prevail there anyway. Now, this price deflationary impact is not very strong, right, because very often financial exchanges are not settled in cash. They are only settled at the margin. Okay, let's take the following example. We have two banks, right? Two banks have customers that are in daily exchanges with one another. I'm a customer of Bank A, you're a customer of Bank B. You are a bartender, I buy a beer at your bar, right? So I pay with a credit card, so you can credit this to your account. It means that your bank then claims a payment on my bank. And the other way around, right? If a customer from your bank buy something from a producer of my bank, associated with my bank, it's the other way around. Right? So what banks do is not to make each time a payment that some such financial claim needs to be settled, but so they bundle them and pay just the difference. That is called clearing. It's the clearing mechanism. Because we can bundle them and just pay the difference, right, we actually don't need as much money as is represented by the overall volume that is being exchanged on the financial market. So it does reduce the price level, but it reduces it rather marginal. It's not a very strong impact. Right? So the price level diminishes, and so therefore all prices diminish. The price of durable consumer goods, in particular real estate, fixed capital goods, capital, as we have seen before, And for financial assets, same thing. Okay. So again, we might raise the question, why would anyone in such an economy save and invest at all, right, if prices shrink? And well, the answer would be the same as the one that we've given before. Right? Shrinking prices are not an obstacle to successful investment. Shrinking prices do not prevent that the value, the real value of my investments diminish if I make them in an environment, in such an environment. So the same reasons as we've discussed before. What are now the implications for the real economy? You will see that indeed financial markets may and would exercise a very beneficial impact. Financial markets indeed leave the incentives intact that we've already observed before, right? Consumer spending would still be discouraged, just as spending on durable consumer goods. There would now be less hoarding, right? But that's simply because now, thanks to financial markets, there exists an interesting alternative, right? Even if you're a very low-income person and you do not want to become an entrepreneur yourself, you just have a stack of money, now you can hand it over to somebody else. You can become a partner in the firm, or you can buy shares on the stock market, or you can grant a credit to a firm, right? And then get paid for your savings. So that's an alternative that you do not have without financial markets. It's precisely what financial markets do. In an economy without financial markets, the only group of persons that invest are entrepreneurs. Right? So only entrepreneurs, therefore, also save, and they actually do save in excess of their own needs, because that's for them a source of revenue. Most of us who are not entrepreneurs, and we save essentially for our own personal projects. When we want to buy a house at some point in the future, we want to pay for the schooling, education of our children, and whatever, and it stops there. But if you actually earn money by saving and investing it, well, you have an additional reason to do this. Right? And then as a consequence, we get what we might call, or in any case what I've called, a financial division of labor. That is, you get in the field of finance and of saving, you get the same phenomenon that we have in the real economy. Our real economy, the developed real economy, is based on the division of labor. It's based on specialization. Some people only do bakery activities. They bake, and they bake bread far in excess of their own needs. Others produce shoes. They produce way more shoes than they will ever be able to wear in their entire lifetime. Why do they do this? Well, because by specializing, well, we can produce more than we could if we did all things at the same time. So it's beneficial from an overall point of view to specialize. Here, thanks to financial markets, we have the same thing. People start saving in excess of their own needs because it might be for them a source of revenue. It's the same principle. So they would actually, thanks to financial markets, not save less, but save more than they would otherwise have saved. So the price deflationary tendencies would be even stronger, and so on and so on, right? Now there's another consequence that follows from it, namely that in the field of the real economy, not only we can finance more firms, more activity, because the volume of saving has increased, but we can now finance also people who have different ideas from those that are already there. Without financial markets, you can become an entrepreneur only if you have substantial savings yourself or your family. Either you have inherited some wealth, or you've gone through 10 or 20 difficult years, which you've saved a lot of money, a lot of your current income, in order to build up a little capital and then start your own company. If you have financial markets, it's not necessary that you do this. You can be fairly young and still set up a company, operating with other people's money. And that clearly increases the competition on the market. Well, and of course you would not expect an economist to say something else, but that competition is beneficial in that case too. Right? So financial markets have in two ways, may exercise and would exercise a very beneficial impact on the real economy, namely first of all by creating additional reasons to save, so that more companies could be financed, right? More activities in sectors remotely connected only to final consumption could be built up. And the second one is that financial markets reinforce competition within the real economy. Now, having said this, so you see, I emphasize these 3 points here, and it's important to keep them in mind. So, right, financial markets are not beneficial because they would increase the overall level of spending. Right? It's exactly the other way around. They would be beneficial because they increase the incentives for savings, and they increase competition on the markets. Some of the financial titles would procure money to consumers. So that's also something that would now enter into the picture, which would not exist in such a case to the same extent in an economy without financial markets, right? So we can, as consumers, we can use other people's savings to buy things that we like right now. So that's a possibility. So this money then, to the extent, would be withheld from the real economy, from production, right? It would not finance production, but it would still create revenue for some producers. And of course, the same thing holds true for public debt. Public debt, from an economic point of view, is a consumptive use of savings, and that's because governments, by definition, do not produce a greater monetary value than the value that they use. Okay? That's the definition of government. If governments could operate profitably, right, then we wouldn't need governments as we know them. Right? We could just handle, well, we have different firms and they produce security services and so on, right? And these would then be productive users of savings. But that's not the model that we've chosen. We want to have governments that produce things even though they don't have a market price, or even though the market price is lower than the value of all the goods that they use to create those services. Right? So the governments that we have opted for destroy value, and they consume value by definition. So therefore, it's not to be expected that they create value. So it's not a moral failure, but that's just what it is. Right? In economic terms, public debt always, by definition, finances consumption. Okay, so you see now, I only needed 15 minutes, right, to make the second step. I'm speeding up. The preparation was well done. I invested a lot of energy in the higher sectors, right, in the more remotely connected areas of my talk, right, so I can move into the final result now very, very fast. Let's move then into monetary interventionism. Monetary interventionism is a special form of government interventionism. When governments intervene in society, in the economy, they always force us to do things that we would not otherwise have done. That's the definition. So they tell us how to use our property, whom to hire, whom not to hire, to pay taxes and how much, all these things that we would not have done spontaneously. Now these interventions very often are repressive, right? It's all the regulation and taxation and so on that we know about, all the interdictions, right? You shall not do this and this, so this is the repressive state. But we also have permissive interventions. And sometimes governments intervene and let us do things that we could not get away with, that we could not do in a truly free economy. A free economy is built on interpersonal relationships that are built on mutual consent and on the respect of contracts. So what governments have done in the monetary field, they've done two things. On the one hand, they have intervened repressively and created monopolies for certain institutions, in particular central banks today, right? But in former times it was commercial banks, special commercial banks, that were involved in government finance. Right? And then in a second step, they have handed over special permissions to those institutions and let them do things that would not have been possible in any other business. For example, they've allowed commercial banks to create money out of nothing. that is to create promises for current goods, not for future goods, but for current goods that they simply do not have. All of us have a bank account. Most of you probably know that if all of us went to our bank at the same time and asked for payment of the amount that is credited on our accounts, the bank could not do this, right? Because it simply does not have enough cash on hand. So that's the principle of a fractional reserve. Right? The bank has given more promises than it can possibly honor and if really called to deliver. It's like saying, well, you have a parking lot owner, right? And people are storing their vehicles in the parking lot. In exchange, they get some tickets that, well, you may reclaim your vehicle. Then while they're not there, while the parking lot owner hands out the vehicles to other people for them to use them. It's a little bit the same thing. Airline companies sometimes do the same thing today. Right? So they have overbooking. They sell more places than really are in the plane. Right? And well, that's probably not a big deal because the margin is very small. It's only marginally more. And then as soon as there's a problem, they offer interesting cash compensations for those who may not fly. Okay. But banks don't do this marginally. They do this massively. Right? It's not just you have an overbooking of 2%. You actually only have a reserve of 2%. Right? It's like if the airline company had 200 seats in the plane and it would have sold 1,000. Right? Well, wait a minute, it would be 10,000. Right? That would be the equivalent. So clearly, right, so this is not a business practice. There's something wrong, something fishy with this business practice. Nobody would not get away with this on such a large scale. But banks have gone away with this because the governments allowed them to do this. And why did governments allow them to do them? Well, because the banks actually handed over a lot of the money that they created to the government. Not only in Slovakia, but in all countries, all over the place. Right, so that's permissive government interventionism. And this is, in our present monetary system, combined with banking-style inflation. Right? So the banking-style increase ex nihilo creation of the money supply. The banks that create money today, be it a central bank or be it a commercial bank, may only create money by lending money to other people. So if you want to buy a house and you need to have money to buy the house, so you take out a mortgage loan from the bank, real estate credit. And then you sign the contract with the bank, and the bank then credits the amount of money that you need on your account. That amount of money, in many cases, did not exist before. It comes into being through your signature. It's you yourself who creates this money. You sign. The government, the bank then has a claim on you, right? It owns a financial asset. You have signed. You've created the financial title. And in exchange for this financial title, for this value that you have created through your signature, the bank credits the corresponding amount on your account. That's great business. Well, it can be. It can be great business. Right? And so that's the only way they may create money today, which is very interesting on different grounds that we cannot discuss right now. Right? So, but anyway, it's a fact. So we need to keep this in mind. Now, in such a system then, what happens with the price level? What's the impact of monetary interventionism on the price level? Well, as we've already seen in the charts that I showed you at the beginning of my lecture, the creation of money can reach such extents that it overcompensates the price deflationary pressure that comes from growth. So if you create much more money, then you have a creation of non-monetary goods at the same time, then money becomes less scarce as compared to these other goods, and prices will no longer fall, they might remain stable, or they might actually increase. And they have been increasing, as we have seen, since World War II. Now this permanent increase of the price level, which comes only from the monetary intervention, which is not a market phenomenon, right? It's a politically induced phenomenon. This trickles down not only on consumer goods, but also on durable consumer goods, on fixed capital goods, on capital and of course also on financial assets. Okay. Now that creates a very interesting situation, because you see, before, the only way to earn money, the only way to earn money with your savings was to invest them in some industrial company. Now you can make money all over the place. There's no longer a monopoly for industrial production. You can earn money just by buying a house and selling as consumer's goods. And you resell it at a higher price and everything works well 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road. You might buy a machine. An entrepreneur might buy a machine. Yes, the alternative, he might either have done the work that needs to be done manually, or he can have it done manually with much less labor and a machine. Now he has an incentive, well, to choose the second option, because the machine offers him the prospect of a capital gain in the future. You can own financial assets, which in a natural economy would have a tendency to shrink in price. Right? You can have this, you can invest in financial assets, just hold them and expect that the price will rise. What are the implications then for the real economy? Well, consumer spending is now actually encouraged. Right? All prices rise permanently. So the same reasoning that we considered before now applies the other way around. Before we said, well, prices tend to fall, so I have a reason to wait. Now I know that prices tend to rise, so I have a reason to anticipate my spending. I have even a reason to take out a credit to buy right now when goods are relatively less expensive. That's the reason why all the young people in this room, as soon as they have a job, will probably take out a credit to buy a house or an apartment. Because the sooner you do it, the better it is. Second, hoarding becomes suicidal. I mean, some old people who have still lived their youth before 1945 or so, right, they're still holding, saving cash. Right? The last ones of those are dying out now. Right? So sometimes we have this in the news, right? There's some grandmother or grandfather who has died, and then the heirs go into the house and they see some boxes full of cash. Right? Because they felt they didn't trust the banks, so they had the money in cash at the home. But of course, it's a very bad way to keep on savings, because they just lose. Yeah? You're plummeted. It's like you're a chicken and the central bank pulls a feather from you every day. The investments can be made now with credit out of thin air. Banks can just create the money that is needed to buy things. There's no longer any need to save it. Big difference than before. We had this example, right? You create the money with your signature that you need to buy the car or the house and so on. But this means then that the incentive to save greatly diminishes. Well, we eventually save because we need to pay back, right? But we save later, and smaller amounts than we would have saved otherwise. Moreover, as we've said, right, consumptive uses of credits are greatly encouraged. We said this in the case of consumer credits, right, but also mortgage loans and public debt. Right? And this then means that many more goods are now used for purely consumptive purposes and are no longer used in firms. Right? So which eats then in the productive capacity of the economy. The list is even longer than this, right? So we need to add a few more points. One other implication of this process is now that we obtain a relentless growth of the credit market. The credit market grows because the supply increases under the impact of an inflationary, a price inflationary environment, but the demand for credit increases as well. The supply of credit increases because of two things. First of all, we have ex nihilo creation of money, which can only enter the economy through a credit. Right? So it's one source. And the other source is you have the people who formerly have hoarded their savings. And now, well, they no longer hoard, but they might then lend the money, so at least they get some compensation. Rather than the money losing all its purchasing power in the course of time, they get some compensation at least. So the supply of credits increases. But the demand for credits increases as well.
Economists know this as the leverage effect.
Some of the students might have heard of this. Right? Leveraging current spending by going into debt. Let's start again with the example of the household, right? The young household takes out a credit in order to buy a house now and eventually pays back the credit. But when it pays back the credit, well, the value of money will have shrunken relative to the value of all other goods. And your revenue is likely bigger than it was at the beginning of the period. If you take a credit out now, the monthly annuities that you have to pay might be 1/3 of your revenue, but your credit goes, let's say, 15 years or 20 years. In 15 or 20 years, it will be just 20% or 10% of your revenue. Right? So you have a very strong incentive to go into debt and to buy the good that you're interested in now. That's called leverage. The same thing, same incentive exists for governments. Governments can anticipate in a price inflationary environment that their future tax revenue will be higher than it is now. Right? So they can take out bigger credits now, right? Because they know that the debt service will grow ever lighter in their budget in the course of time. And firms can do the same thing. Right? Firms can take out credits now. Say you have a firm that operates with with a return of 10%. It earns 10% of the capital on the capital invested, and the bank proposes a credit at 5% or 2%. Well, then you can take all this money into your firm. You can extend your activities and earn 10% of that money. Let's say approximately you can earn 10% of that money, and it costs you only 2%. Right? So you earn more money without having to save any more money. So the credit market grows, and that's indeed what we observed. In the 19th century, the credit market was very small. Today, it dominates financial markets. And as a consequence, because financial markets become so big, and especially the credit sector, more resources are being drawn into the financial market. Today you have hundreds of thousands of people who are working as analysts, consultants, etc., accountants for financial firms. The same people could work as gardeners, carpenters, painters, whatever, or they could do some other work somewhere else in the economy. Right? So all the services that they render within the financial world, well, they're so to say withdrawn from the rest of the economy. It's like a tax on the rest of the economy. Within the firms, debt finance replaces equity finance, right? Thanks to this leverage effect that I mentioned before, right? So banks no longer finance their activities with their own money, but with the money of other people. Now, of course, that's risky, right? Because if you're in debt, you're obliged toward other people, and that might be a problem. If you cannot pay, but it's less of a problem if you have a central bank and if you have the government stepping in to bail you out, right, to pay your way if you're in trouble. And that is exactly what we're doing. So again, you might ask yourself, why are we doing this? Why have governments all over the world bailed out the banks? Why have they bailed out bank customers? Why have they given them money when they could not pay? Why did they not allow bankruptcy? Well, because if they had allowed bankruptcy, it would have entailed a collapse of the entire financial edifice that we've built up in the preceding 100 years. And this would have ruined government credit, and of course it would have created great turmoil within the general population, and so would have created angry voters. Now the consequence, so this is what happens, and as a consequence, the economy becomes more fragile. If everybody works just with his own money, if everybody really works only with his own money, there can be no bankruptcy by definition. Right? Some people would just go out of business because they just don't earn enough by investing their money. It becomes uninteresting, but nobody would become bankrupt. But as soon as everybody is into debt and very strongly indebted, well, then the debt of person A is the asset of person B. So if I am person A and I can no longer pay back, well, then person B has a lower wealth than he otherwise would have had. And if person B is heavily into debt, well, then person C, to whom he is indebted, can no longer receive his money either. Right? So you create snowballing effects, right, of financial fragility that result ultimately from the monetary system. Whew, okay, now I talked a long time, it's 1.5 hours, but it's a big subject, so I hope you will forgive me. I conclude. Right? The problems, let me first point out that the problems that we're discussing here is not to be seen in any particular sort of monetary policy carried out by central banks. Right? The problem is the monetary system per se, a system that has been created, that's been put into place in order to facilitate a permanent expansion of the money supply ex nihilo, and therefore creates also a permanent increase of the price level. So it's a system as a whole that is in need of reform. What should be done then? Well, one approach one could take is just to reform the financial system. Right? We have too much debt in our current system. That's how things stand at the surface. Right? We have a lot of debt. Not all of this debt can be paid back. In fact, a lot of this debt cannot be paid back. We just need to think of Greece. Right? So we could think of a reform that just says, okay, well, I mean, we just need to reorganize everything and cut the losses. Right? So in order to prevent that the economy collapses, we'll all sit together, or our political representatives will all sit together around the green table, and then they make up a plan of whose debts will be cut and who will be losing this money. And of course, we guess all who will be the losers is typically you people not sitting at the table. Okay. Well, anyway, that's anyway what's coming ahead, right? So there should be no illusion that this is coming anyway. Right? There's no way around this. The point is now is the following. If we do this without reforming at the same time the monetary system, then we'll get the same thing in a generation down the road. Right? If we create a clean slate right now, we cut everybody's debt, there's no more debt in the economy, but we don't change the monetary system, a system that encourages debt, that makes it worthwhile to be into debt a lot, and that creates these consequences that we've pointed out. Well, we get the same types of problems in record time. So therefore, the only sane approach, in my eyes, is to combine the two things. We need to have a financial reform, and at the same time, a genuine monetary reform. And ideally, the monetary reform should seek to put the production of money back on the same legal foundations, and ultimately the same moral foundations, as all other businesses, namely on a competitive foundation. Right? So we should have, again, a juridical framework that allows people to enter the production of money and to choose those monies that they like best. And as a consequence, we would get in record time a monetary system in which only the best products are being offered and would be used at the best prices. In practice, it will probably boil down to something like a commodity money standard, like a silver standard or a gold standard, or the two at the same time. As it's difficult to anticipate this future. I'm just an economist. I don't have a glass ball that would tell me what will happen in the future. All I can tell you is that the system that we have right now deserves to be discarded as quickly and as thoroughly as possible. And I hope that I've made you understand some of the reasons that have led me to this conclusion. Thank you for your attention.